Okay, so you want to own a cement plant, a quarry of limestone, a kiln burning through the night, and trucks rolling out before dawn. The $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill roars behind you, and it looks like the easiest money any manufacturer could ever ask for. Here is what the broker never shows you: the permit that took 7 years to sign, the kiln lining that burned through last October, the natural gas bill that doubled, and the quiet fact that you still cannot ship a single bag more than 200 miles without going into the red. Cement is one of the most misunderstood businesses in America. On the outside, it looks like manufacturing. On the inside, it looks like a business chained to a single map. Some cement plants print money for decades. Some quietly grind their owners into paste while still appreciating on paper. By the end of this, you will know which one you would be buying. The first thing you learn when you actually start pricing cement plants is that there is no such thing as one cement plant. There are four different animals living under one name. An integrated plant is what most people picture. You dig limestone out of the ground, you crush it, you burn it in a rotary kiln at 1500 degrees Celsius, and you grind the clinker into powder. The capital cost for one of these ranges from $200 million for a small operation to $500 million for a modern one. 40-year depreciation, no shortcut around any of it. Then there is the grinding-only plant. You skip the burning step. You buy imported clinker from Turkey or Vietnam, you grind it, you bag it, you sell it. Capital is much lighter, $30 to $80 million, but your margins are thinner, and you are permanently exposed to shipping costs on the raw material coming in. Then there is the ready-mix concrete plant. This one does not make cement at all. It takes cement, sand, gravel, and water, and it delivers wet concrete to the job site in a rotating drum. Ready-mix has a rule that manufacturing textbooks rarely mention. You have 90 minutes from batch to pour. 90 minutes. After that, the concrete sets inside your truck. A traffic jam is not an inconvenience in ready-mix. It is a total loss. The truck itself sometimes has to be scrapped, along with the ruined batch inside. And finally, there is the import terminal. This is a coastal facility where clinker arrives by ship, gets stored in silos, and ships out from there by rail or truck. Terminals are the only way to bypass geography, and we will come back to why they matter later, because the federal government does not let that bypass stay free for long. So you pick your animal, and then you find out that the sticker price you were looking at was only the first line of the actual invoice. So far, so good. But here is the layer of cost that nobody in the broker deck ever puts inside the summary page. The kiln itself is the single largest thing in the plant, and it is running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 360 days a year. Because if you turn it off, the refractory lining cools too fast. It cracks, and restarting a cold kiln takes about 3 weeks of preheating and monitoring. 3 weeks of no production, 3 weeks of paying labor and financing, and about $15 million in relining costs before the first bag ships back out again. So the kiln never really stops, which means your fuel bill never really stops either. And fuel is where the second unpleasant surprise waits for you. Energy is roughly 40% of your total cost of production. Petroleum coke, natural gas, sometimes ground tires, sometimes coal, whatever the region allows and the permit allows. When gas prices double, your margin does not compress by 10%. It compresses by 20%, sometimes more, sometimes into the negative for a full quarter. Then comes the quarry. You need a limestone reserve close to the plant, because moving limestone more than a few miles kills the economics before you even start. Getting a new quarry permitted in the United States now takes an average of 7 years. Environmental review, community hearings, water table studies, dust modeling, wildlife surveys, everything. 7 years before you break ground. 7 years of consulting fees, 7 years of lawyers, 7 years of no revenue on that particular asset. And that is if you get the permit at all. About 1 in 3 permit applications for a new large quarry in the US never receives final approval. The ones that do get approved come with royalty structures that eat between $1 and $3 off every ton of cement you produce for the next 30 years. Then there is the truck fleet. Bulker trucks, the sealed pneumatic ones that carry cement powder, run about $180,000 per unit. A mid-sized plant needs 40 to 60 of them, plus the drivers, plus DOT compliance, plus the insurance, plus the maintenance, plus a spare fleet for winter breakdowns. And drivers with the right CDL endorsement for hazardous materials and pneumatic loads have been in shortage in the US for a solid decade straight now. Insurance on a cement fleet has roughly doubled in the past 5 years, driven by nuclear verdicts in accident litigation on interstate highways across the country. Then, finally, environmental compliance. Air permits, EPA MACT rules on particulate emissions, groundwater monitoring, dust suppression on the quarry roads, closure bonds for when the mine eventually shuts. One EPA violation for exceeding particulate limits typically runs between $5 and $15 million per event, not per year, per event, sometimes per inspection cycle. And enforcement has been tightening every single administration since 1990, regardless of which party is holding the White House at the time. This is a one-way ratchet. There is also the closure bond. Before you open, most states now require a cash bond of $10 to $40 million to guarantee eventual land restoration when you shut. That money sits idle for decades, earning almost nothing, and cannot be pulled back until the mine is fully closed and inspected and released by the regulator. And every regulatory change written into law over the next 30 years applies to your plant, because plants do not get grandfathered forever, only for a while. So when you finally add everything up, the equipment you can actually see is a small fraction of the money you are really spending to operate the business. The kiln is expensive, the trucks are expensive, but the ground, the paperwork, and the fuel are what really own you, month after month, year after year. Which brings us to the number that most first-time buyers never see on the pro forma, but that quietly determines whether you make money or bleed it. Every truck that leaves your gate carrying powder is a mobile clock ticking down against distance, fuel price, driver hours, and the price the buyer is willing to accept. Because in cement, unlike almost every other manufactured good sold in America, the buyer is not just buying your product. They are buying your location on the map. This is not an accident. It is the business model. And it is the reason the next thing we talk about matters more than everything you just heard. Everything you just learned about cost turns into a single question. Who actually decides what price you can charge for a ton of cement out of your plant? The answer is not the market. The answer is not the customer. The answer is a circle drawn around your plant on a highway map of the region. A ton of cement leaves your gate priced at roughly $120 in the United States. That is the number your revenue model begins with. Now, trucking a ton of cement costs roughly 15 to 20 cents per ton per mile, depending on the current diesel price, the driver, and the specific route. So 1 ton of cement moved 100 miles adds $15 to $20 of pure shipping cost on top of the base price. 200 miles, $30 to $40 per ton on top of the base price, which means shipping is now roughly a third of the invoice. At 300 miles, shipping alone eats about 40% of what the buyer is paying. Nobody in this industry stays in business at 40%. So the working rule of thumb, the one every cement executive in America can recite from memory, is that 200 miles is the outer edge of profit. Beyond 200 miles, you are not selling cement anymore. You are subsidizing a truck. And your competitor across town is not subsidizing anything. Rail can push that distance further, out to about 500 miles. But you need a rail spur on both ends and a large depot on each side. Most plants do not have that. Which means for the average cement plant in America, its economically defensible market is a circle 200 miles wide. Draw that circle on a map of the United States. Then draw one around every other plant. What you get is not a market. It is a mosaic of overlapping fortresses, each with its own moat, measured in gallons of diesel and hours of driver time on the interstate. Every cement plant in America is a fortress, and the moat is measured in miles. Read that again. The 5 biggest players in North America, Cemex, Holcim, Heidelberg Materials, CRH, and Eagle Materials, together control roughly 70% of installed capacity in the country. And they do not really compete with each other. They compete with distance. They divide up the map, and each one holds the region it already owns. Watch what happens when a competitor tries to ship into someone else's territory. The freight cost climbs, the delivered price climbs, and the local buyer buys local. Because for the buyer, a ready-mix producer, or a general contractor, the delivered price is the only price that matters. Origin is completely irrelevant. So the incumbent plant, sitting at the center of its own 200-mile circle, is protected by a shipping cost it did not have to build. Somebody else, Geography itself, built that moat. And the moat gets deeper every single time diesel prices rise, which is often and always unpredictably. Now here is the question that starts to sound rhetorical, but is not. Why has no new integrated cement plant been built in the United States since 2008? Not because America stopped needing cement. Consumption per capita has been climbing steadily since the 2015 recovery. Demand is genuinely not the problem here. The reason no new plant has been built is that you cannot break into someone else's map. The moat is already dug, and it is dug deep. To build a new integrated plant today, you would need 7 years of permits, $400 million of capital, and a limestone quarry within trucking distance. And every good limestone reserve within trucking distance of any growing city already belongs to somebody. Because the industry quietly consolidated 40 years ago. The land the previous owners walked over back in the 1970s is worth more today than every truck and every kiln inside every plant that sits on it. This is why cement plants trade at industrial multiples during a normal market, but at real estate multiples during any consolidation cycle triggered by rising demand. Because whoever buys the plant is not really buying the equipment. They are buying the 200-mile circle around it and the quarry beneath it. You are not competing with cement companies, you are competing with maps. And most people trying to enter this industry never really understand that until too late. They think they can outbid, out-engineer, out-market their way in. And every year, a private equity fund somewhere tries. And every year, most of them lose. Because the incumbent does not have to do anything clever. The incumbent just has to sit still while gas prices work against the outsider trying to enter. There is one way, however, to bypass the map. And that is where import terminals come in, and where things get complicated with the federal government. An import terminal on the coast can bring in clinker from Turkey, Vietnam, or Mexico at prices sometimes 20% below domestic production cost. For coastal markets in the US, this used to be a real weapon. Cheap clinker at the port, ground locally, delivered into the city. But the domestic majors do not enjoy being flanked, so they file anti-dumping petitions, and the Commerce Department obliges. Every few years, tariffs go up on cement clinker from another country. Turkey got hit in 2023. Vietnam got flagged in 2024. Countervailing duties can add 10 to 20% to the landed cost of imported clinker at the port, which effectively pushes the terminal back into the same moat problem. It cannot ship inland far enough to matter because now it is not cheap enough to matter. So the domestic map holds, the 200-mile circles hold, and the value of every existing cement plant in America quietly appreciates on the balance sheet. This is why the private equity money that has flooded into cement over the past decade is not chasing margin. It is chasing map coverage. Every acquisition, every roll-up, every consolidation deal is really a question of whose circles you now own and how much of the interstate map you cover. You do not scale cement by building. You scale cement by buying. And the number of things left to buy is finite and shrinking and known to everyone. This is the big idea of the entire industry. Cement is not manufacturing. Cement is real estate wearing a factory as a very convincing disguise. Read that again. Cement is real estate wearing a factory as a disguise. Everything about how the industry behaves flows from that one single fact. And once you accept that fact, the next set of behaviors, the pricing behavior, the capacity behavior, the regulatory behavior, all start to make sense. Once you accept that every plant is a fortress, you start noticing something strange about the way cement is priced across the United States. For a product that is nearly impossible to differentiate, a ton of gray powder is a ton of gray powder. The prices should be at war constantly. They are not. Cement prices in most U.S. regions move in lockstep, 4 to 6% per year, almost every year, without fail. Nobody signed an agreement. Nobody sat in a room. Because sitting in a room agreeing on prices is criminal price fixing under the Sherman Act. Instead, something else happens. Something that is technically legal and structurally almost identical. It is called price signaling through quarterly earnings guidance. One of the majors, Cemex, Holcim, Heidelberg, whoever moves first, announces on its quarterly investor call that regional pricing will rise $5 per ton next quarter. They do not have to force anything. They just have to say it out loud. And every other major, sitting in their own fortress, hears the same message. Within 30 to 60 days, the other majors publish similar guidance. Nobody agreed. Nobody colluded. And yet, the price moves as if they did. The regulator has been watching this pattern for 40 years, and no antitrust prosecution has ever stuck because the pattern is not illegal on paper. This is not an accident. It is the business model. And it is the reason cement plants earn margins that other commodity businesses can only ever dream about. EBITDA margins across the North American cement industry have averaged 22 to 28% for 15 consecutive years. That is not commodity behavior at all. That is the behavior of a regulated utility, or of a subscription service, or of a pharmaceutical company with a patent, not of a factory selling powder. Because in cement, the patent is geography, and the collusion is silent, structural, and impossible to sue for in any federal court. The second thing you notice is what nobody in this industry actually does. Nobody builds excess capacity. Nobody starts a price war. Nobody tries to steal territory. Because if any one of the majors expanded capacity beyond regional demand, the price would collapse for everybody in the region, including for the expander themselves. So capacity utilization is managed carefully, plant by plant, region by region. Overcapacity is treated as heresy inside every one of these company boardrooms. New capacity gets added only when a growing region genuinely needs it. And even then, the incumbents usually add the capacity themselves, not a newcomer to the map. You start to understand that cement is not a market. Cement is a coordination game played across state lines by 5 companies that never actually speak. This is the business you are considering buying into. A game that is stable, quiet, and enormously profitable, as long as nothing structural changes. But something is changing. And it is changing at a speed that most cement executives are still not internalizing publicly on their earnings calls. The cement industry produces about 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. That is more than every commercial airline on Earth combined, all put together. Every ton of clinker released from a kiln releases roughly 9/10 of a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, half from the fuel, half from the limestone itself. Even if you switched all cement kilns to renewable electricity tomorrow morning, the limestone chemistry does not care. The CO2 comes out anyway, which makes cement one of the hardest industrial emitters on Earth to decarbonize. And that fact has put a very visible target on the entire industry's back. In 2026, the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, known as CBAM, takes full effect. It taxes imported cement based on its embedded carbon. CBAM is designed to protect European producers from cheap, high-carbon imports. But it also sets a global template that other major economies will eventually copy. The United States, for now, has no federal carbon tax on cement, which means U.S. plants are entirely by accident of timing, currently protected. This protection is not policy, it is timing. And every cement plant owner in America is now quietly betting on how long the timing actually lasts. Because if the U.S. does implement a federal carbon price, which is proposed in Congress roughly every 2 years now, the math changes almost overnight. A $20 per ton carbon price on cement translates directly into $18 of extra cost per ton of product, on margins that average $30 per ton. So a carbon tax does not tax profit. A carbon tax removes profit. 60% of it in the very first year that the tax takes effect. And the only way to reduce that hit is to install carbon capture equipment, which currently costs about $200 to $400 million per plant. You already paid $400 million to buy the plant. Now the regulator wants another $300 million to keep operating it. There is a federal tax credit, called Section 45Q, that partially offsets the cost of carbon capture installation. Right now, at the moment, it is voluntary. If it ever becomes mandatory, and the political direction has been moving that way for 8 years now, the free ride ends the day it becomes mandatory. This is the trap. On paper, you are a manufacturer. In reality, you are a bet on climate policy going one direction and staying there for 30 years. And here is what actually happened when a major producer failed exactly that bet. In 2022, Holcim was forced to sell its entire Indian cement business. Not because it was unprofitable, it was highly profitable, but because Holcim's global carbon roadmap could not accommodate the emissions profile of those 33 Indian plants. So Holcim sold 63 million tons of annual capacity to the Adani Group for about $6.4 billion, one of the largest industrial divestments in history, not because of market forces, because of a climate math problem inside one company's own strategy document, sitting on a boardroom table in Switzerland. The carbon tax is not a fee, it is an eviction notice. And nobody knows when it arrives, or whether it arrives at all, or where it lands first. That uncertainty is the second layer of risk in owning a cement plant. Not the equipment, not the labor. The regulatory clock running silently behind everything else. So let's talk about what happens when someone actually buys into this business and gets it badly wrong. Not hypothetically, with names and years and real dollar figures. In 2007, at the peak of the pre-crisis credit cycle, Cemex was the third largest cement producer in the world, based in Monterrey, Mexico. It decided to buy Rinker Group, an Australian construction materials company with major U.S. operations, for $14.6 billion in cash and stock. It was a bet on continued growth in the U.S. housing market. It was a bet on continued cheap credit. It was a bet on the map expanding indefinitely. To finance the deal, Cemex took on debt that eventually reached about $30 billion at its peak. Every fortress they now owned came with a mortgage attached. Then 2008 happened. U.S. housing starts collapsed by roughly 70% between 2006 and 2010. Cement demand fell by almost 40% in 2 years. Every one of those 200-mile circles was still there, but the buyers inside those circles had stopped ordering. The revenue disappeared, and the interest bill did not. Cemex spent the next 7 years selling assets in Australia, Egypt, Croatia, and Spain to pay down debt. Its stock lost roughly 90% from the 2007 peak price. The company survived. Barely. And only because its lenders, facing the possibility of taking over cement plants they did not want, chose to restructure the debt instead. The lesson from Cemex is not that the geography failed. The geography worked exactly as advertised. Cemex still controlled the fortresses. The problem was cyclical demand, because cement demand is tied to construction, and construction is tied to interest rates, and interest rates are tied to macroeconomic conditions that no plant owner controls. A geographic monopoly is not a demand monopoly. You can own the only cement plant in a region and still lose money if the region stops building. That is the risk hiding underneath the moat. The moat holds perfectly, but it does not fill itself. Somebody outside the moat has to want cement. Now compare Cemex to a company that got the same industry right during the same 15 years. Eagle Materials, headquartered in Dallas, Texas. Eagle owns 8 integrated cement plants, concentrated in the American heartland, Texas, Missouri, Nevada, Illinois, Wyoming. Not coastal, not overbuilt, not overleveraged. Its EBITDA margins have averaged around 32% for the past decade. Its stock price has roughly tripled since 2015. Its debt has stayed manageable. Eagle did not try to be a global company. Eagle picked a piece of the map and defended it. And the piece it picked was the middle of the country. The Heartland region has population growth, low regulatory intensity, cheap natural gas, and infrastructure bill projects concentrated along interstate corridors. Every variable pointed the right way. Meanwhile, U.S. Concrete, a coastal ready-mix player, went the opposite direction. Coastal urban markets, thin margins, exposed to permit fights and city traffic issues. In 2021, U.S. Concrete was acquired by Vulcan Materials for $1.28 billion. Not as a growth acquisition, as a roll-up absorption. Same industry, same product, 2 different pieces of the map, 2 very different decades of results. That is what geography does to identical businesses in the end. So now let's put you inside the numbers. Let's say you buy an integrated cement plant in Central Texas or Eastern Ohio in 2026. $400 million of capital, roughly. Finance 60% debt, 40% equity. That is your starting position on the balance sheet. Your plant produces about 1.5 million tons of cement per year. Delivered price averages $130 per ton after freight adjustments in the region. Annual revenue, about $180 million. Not because you sell more than anyone else, because you sell inside a defended radius. Now, the optimistic scenario. Infrastructure bill spending flows through your region for the next 6 years. Nobody builds new capacity nearby. Gas prices stay moderate. You run at 90% utilization. EBITDA margins hit 28%. That is $50 million of EBITDA in a good year, every year, for 6 full years. You pay down debt aggressively during that window. By year 8, your equity investment of $160 million has compounded at roughly 12% annually. You now own an asset that generates recurring EBITDA in the 50 million range, in a region where nobody else can build a competing plant. This is the scenario the private equity pitch decks always show you. And it is a real scenario. It has happened before. Eagle Materials is living proof. But now, the realistic scenario. Same plant, same region, same starting price. But 3 variables move against you across the same 8-year holding period. First, the infrastructure bill spending peaks in year 3 and starts declining. Cement demand in your region flattens, and then dips 5% per year afterward. Second, a federal carbon price is enacted in year 4 at $15 per ton of CO2, phasing up to $30 by year 7 of your ownership. That is $18 of new cost per ton of product by year 7, on cement selling at $130. 14% of your price, simply gone. Third, to remain compliant with regulation, you install partial carbon capture equipment starting in year 5. $250 million of additional capital, financed at prevailing rates. Your EBITDA margin compresses from 28% down to 14%. Your annual EBITDA drops from $50 million to $18 million. Your debt service does not drop, it rises because you had to borrow again for the capture equipment installation. The math turns hard against you. By year 8, your equity has compounded at roughly 3 to 5% per year, about the same return as owning a 10-year US Treasury bond. Except a Treasury bond does not require you to run a kiln 24 hours a day, or manage a fleet, or navigate an EPA audit every quarter. Same plant, same location, same executive team, same equipment. Different decade, different regulatory environment, different outcome by a factor of 3 to 4 in total returns. This is what owning a cement plant actually means. Not the plant. The plant is fine. It is the decade around the plant that decides everything. And no cement executive, no broker, no private equity fund partner can tell you with confidence which decade you are actually about to buy into ahead of time. They will show you the map, they will show you the fortress. What they cannot show you is the weather outside the fortress walls. Because in cement, the weather is macroeconomic policy, interest rates, and the carbon regulation calendar. And none of those things are on the pro forma sheet. So if you do decide to buy a cement plant, here is what actually determines whether you succeed. And it is not any of the things the brochure will list. It is not the age of the kiln. It is not the efficiency of the grinding line. It is not the quality of the limestone chemistry you happen to have. It is the shape of the 200-mile circle around your plant, and how many other circles are competing for territory inside it right now. It is the population growth rate of the counties you can reach without going into the red on freight cost. It is the shape of the map. It is whether the infrastructure bill projects for the next 6 years happen to run through the corridor of interstates you can actually service profitably. Because that $1.2 trillion in federal money is real, but it is not a growth curve. It is a window that will close, roughly 6 to 8 years wide. And after that window closes, the projects end, the job sites empty out, and cement demand normalizes downward again. Every cement plant owner in America is quietly betting on how much of their 8-year payback they can extract before that window finally closes on them. So the first thing you learn is that this is not a growth business. It is a cyclical business, protected by geography, pretending to be manufacturing. The second thing you learn is that the one variable that could destroy everything, carbon regulation, is not on anyone's dashboard when you buy in. It is not in the brochure. It is not in the offering memorandum. It is a political calendar that answers to nobody who actually owns the plant. It is the weather. It shows up when it shows up. And the plants that were built for a world without it are the ones that suffer first. So the successful cement plant owner is not really an industrialist. They are a geographer, a cycle reader, and a regulatory forecaster all at once. They own a map, they know their radius. They read the interest rate cycle. And they wait for the demand to come to them on its own schedule. When it comes, they do not chase growth. They harvest margin. They do not expand. They defend. Because expansion in this industry is heresy against the model. They do not race against competitors. Their competitors are sitting inside their own circles, doing the exact same thing. Nobody moves, everybody profits. And when the cycle turns, when demand falls, when a new carbon rule arrives, they do not panic. They cut, they wait, they preserve the map, because the equipment can be replaced, the fleet can be replaced, the workforce can be replaced. The 200-mile circle cannot ever be replaced. This is the entire business, distilled. Not a factory, not a product. A piece of geography wrapped around a kiln, held for as long as it holds. Which brings us back to where we started, to that bag of cement that cannot travel 200 miles without erasing its own profit along the way. That is not a flaw of the product. That is the entire competitive advantage of the industry. That is why the industry exists in the exact shape it does. Every dollar of the infrastructure bill is going to flow into a specific zip code, and whoever owns the plant closest to that zip code wins. Everyone else, no matter how modern, no matter how efficient, no matter how green, is watching from too far away to matter to the buyer. So remember the number that started this whole thing, 200 miles. That is not just a shipping constraint. That is the entire business model. The cement is not what you are selling. It never really was. The cement is the excuse. The distance is what you are actually selling. The distance nobody else can travel to reach your buyer. That is the business. That has always been the business.